There is some AI technology out there that entrepreneurs are developing to sell into HR department. And that's when I realized that we really need to get involved here, because now, as everyone knows, but even before, especially for large global organizations, it's no longer a question, are you going to use AI in HR? We are so far past that point. The question now is, what are you going to use? How are you going to use it? What purpose are you going to use it for within your organization? And most importantly, to my concern, how are you going to comply with longstanding laws that apply to those decisions, whether or not you're using technology to make that decision or you're using your human workers? And that's where I'm trying to change the narrative on this, because if you look how these products are being sold on being more efficient, more economical, and make better employment decisions by eliminating the biggest problem that HR has faced since its existence, which is the human.
Keith, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for making me look bad, by the way. It's looking way too sharp.
It's the Washington, D.C. costume that I've brought here to London.
Do you have them like all in the exact same color, all in the wardrobe all day long?
All dark D.C. suits.
Well, is there like an actual dress code?
If I didn't dress like this, you wouldn't believe me that I'm in this role. So it's very important that I at least play the part.
Is that what it is? So if you dress as really casual, people are like, no.
Exactly.
Yeah. How are you anyway?
Good. Really excited for our combo.
Yeah. What takes you to what apart from this show, what brought you to the UK?
Just, I get to Europe pretty often.
Nice.
As you know, a lot of these issues are global, which is what makes this practice so exciting, is that, what we do in the United States is largely followed by global corporations in the HR space. So it's important for me to leave DC, see what's going on around the world in HR, and really talk to HR leaders across the globe for me to be able to do my job better in DC.
Before we get into the current role and the work that you're doing, tell everyone a little bit more about your background and sort of the journey to where we are now.
Yeah, so I was a labor and employment lawyer before joining government. So this is all I've done my career, just on a different angle. Defending corporations, defending HR departments in disputes, in labor and employment disputes. In 2017, I left the practice and joined the U.S. government, where I went to the U.S. Department of Labor at the Wage and Hour Division, which did a lot of the overtime issues, pay issues, minimum wage, child labor, immigration issues related to pay, very diverse portfolio. And then in 2019, I was nominated to be commissioner on the EEOC and confirmed by the U.S. Senate in 2020.
Wow.
So I've been in this role since then.
Yeah, amazing. What made you interested in transferring over from corporate to government?
I was really interested in the policy side, and I really wanted to see the other side of the practice. And like I said, moving to DC was a life-changing experience.
Yeah.
Working for the agencies that deal with the issues that you're dealing with in private practice on a daily basis, being on the other side, it's almost like getting a PhD in HR, in labor and employment. So it was a great experience for me in that regard.
Because I normally see it happen the other way around. Like people could go from government and then into private, like kind of done it the opposite way.
It gives me a unique perspective. It really allows me to see what HR leaders have to deal with on a daily basis, opposed to, a lot of people in these roles, as you say, you start out from the government and then you go the other way. You don't really see the day-to-day of how difficult the practice can be.
Yeah, you get it. Probably good for the audience then to break down, what is the EEOC? So
the EEOC is the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. EEOC, so everything in DC.
They love a good acronym.
We love good acronyms there. So we are the federal agency responsible for enforcing all laws that prevent workplace discrimination and advance equal employment opportunity in the workforce. So we are the regulators of human resources.
Interesting.
It's that simple. We are, the government agency that's responsible for enforcing laws against and for HR. And our agency is very special. It was born out of the Civil Rights Act 60 years ago.
Wow.
So when Martin Luther King marched in Washington, D.C., the result of that was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which created the EEOC, which created the rights for workers in the United States, applicants and employees, to have these civil rights protections, which are some of the strongest in the world. And, part of the reason why I travel all across the world is that we were really one of the first agencies to set that groundwork for civil rights laws in the workplace. So a lot of other countries since then use us as a model on how to create employment laws, how to create workplace protections, what those protected characteristics are, which we'll get into across the world, especially for large global organizations. They're really going to be using the EEOC standard, generally across the world in most places. So that's why our agency is extremely relevant. And like I say, we are the premier civil rights agency really in the world because how strong our protections are.
Yeah, because that's something I didn't realize when I first saw you traveling and speaking, and I was like, oh, like there's more to this than just just the US, but also you have huge influence worldwide.
Right. A lot of governments are going to look to what we've done just because, everyone understands the civil rights movements in the 1960s in the US. So we're very impactful agency.
Yeah. Could you break down some of the work that you do specifically? Ben, you mentioned some of the different areas.
Yeah, so our mission is to prevent and remedy employment discrimination and advance equal employment opportunity in the workplace. So we're really known for the remedying employment discrimination. Mm-hmm. So again, we are the civil rights law enforcement agency in the United States that employees come to complain of discrimination, and we have to investigate it. For the most part in the United States, whether you work for a private company, state or local government, or even the federal government itself, you cannot go to court directly and sue your employer. You have to come to us. So we see almost every single case of employment discrimination in the United States, no matter what sector you're in. So it really puts us in a good position to see what the trends are in human resources.
In the UK, then it's like the complete opposite in the UK, where you go straight to the company directly, as opposed to through yourselves, where you have all of the data. And
they come to us, and then we do the investigation. After a certain period of time, then they can hire private lawyers and go to court themselves. Mm-hmm. But we get first shot at all employment discrimination cases in the United States.
Interesting. What are some of the misconceptions that people have?
That we're, most HR professionals, which is such an important reason for me to get out there, think of the EEOC just as a law enforcement agency, because the most HR professionals, and I saw this in private practice, their only interaction with the EEOC is that they get a charge of discrimination, which is what we call a complaint of discrimination. And, then they're accused of doing something wrong and they're already in a defensive position. What a lot of people don't know is the other part of our mission statement, which is to prevent employment discrimination from occurring in the first place, and also advancing equal employment opportunity in the workforce, which gets to making sure that the people are getting the jobs based upon merit and skill and not having any other factor play a lawful or unlawful role in that decision. So I've really been trying to raise the awareness of not only are we a law enforcement agency at our core to protect workers, we also have an important mission to make sure that HR professionals understand these very complicated regulations that they face in every type of decision they're making. And what's unique about our laws, it applies to A to Z of the employment relationship. So, a lot of people in the HR space, a lot of it's about hiring, right? So we do everything from hiring, firing, promotion, wages, trainings, benefits, terminations. So really the entire life cycle of an employee is what my agency regulates. And that's very similar to the mission of HR departments. So I really, in this role, have been out there trying to talk to HR leaders and getting them more involved in the regulatory aspect of this, because before, a lot of these conversations were just had with lawyers and government officials and not the actual practitioners that are out there. So every aspect of an HR professional's daily job, we have some say in the regulation and in the law enforcement side of it too.
Yeah. What does that look like from a practical perspective of how you support them? What are some of the specific things that you're doing to help support them beyond the reactive part that you mentioned?
Well, as you know, a lot of HR is reacting to what happens.
Yeah.
And we're in that same position too. So what happens with us is that we get very dictated by what's happening in the global news. And that's on us to then put out guidance to make sure that HR professionals can understand what the changes are, whether in the regulation or hot topics. Now, let me take a step back and just show how, as HR leaders have been all over the place in what their priorities are, same with us. So if you look after the recession in 2008, when the global economy crashed, we saw a lot of claims of age discrimination, right? Because older workers were being laid off.
Yeah.
Then So we start putting out guidance about how you could support older workers in the workplace, make sure that they're not getting laid off just because they're the highest paid, to lead to age discrimination cases. Then the Me Too movement happens. So then we have to, as an agency, we have to put all of our resources into investigating all those sexual harassment claims, even though sexual harassment has been unlawful since the 1960s. When the spotlight was on it because of the terrible news that was happening worldwide, we had to then not only do law enforcement, we had to put out best practices and guidance to ensure that you have the proper open door policies to report sexual harassment, to prevent sexual harassment from occurring, et cetera. Then other news, the U.S. women's soccer team, right?
Yeah.
Pay equity. Huge. We're in the front and center of that. We have to deal with
you never know really what's coming at you.
Right. And then like everyone else, but that's the same as HR.
That's just,
so then what happens? COVID happens. And it's so dynamic with COVID too, if you think about it, because look, in the beginning, it was all about, how do we protect our employees? And are we allowed to take temperature checks of our employees? Are we allowed to exclude employees from the office if they have symptoms of COVID, even though, they may not have COVID? Then the vaccinations came out. And if you remember, there was a big push towards the mandatory vaccinations, whether it's by governments or certain employers. We were involved in that and talking about the parameters of, if you're going to have a mandatory vaccination policy, well, here's who potentially gets exemptions under the law. And then if you remember, a lot of people weren't getting the vaccine, and a lot of companies were doing vaccination incentives. We're saying, win a new car potentially if you get the vaccine. And there are issues with that, because if people can't get the vaccine, it may be discriminating against an employment benefit to those who are able to get it. And then moving on, long haul COVID. Now some of the issues with return to work. It just never ends. And that's my point. It's the same with HR. It never ends, and you never know where your priorities are. So very much like HR professionals, we have to adapt in not only ensuring that the laws are being enforced in all these different areas and not waiting for some global news to put the spotlight on it, but also to make sure that HR professionals have that guidance to prevent the next Me Too movement, to prevent the next big pay equity case from occurring. So we have a dual mission. I think that's the biggest misconception, that we're just a law enforcement agency.
Like, how do you and the team make decisions on what? There's so much being thrown at you geopolitically, from the media, from politics, from so many different areas. How do you choose what battles to fight?
Well,
so
it is Washington D.C., so you have a lot of stakeholders on various sides. You have unions, you have civil rights groups, you have chambers of commerce, you have different trade associations. And what's so unique about our agency, and with HR profession too, is that we're industry agnostic. So we deal with every industry. So the issues facing the manufacturing industries are different than issues facing the retail industry, different than facing finance or knowledge worker industries, right? So it's so difficult in that sense of what do you have to prioritize and what do you have to focus on? And a lot of it, unfortunately, is driven by, well, now there's a huge spike in these claims. And why is that happening?
Just measure that. You got the data.
We have the data because they have to come to us. So that's really, where I've been trying to talk to HR leaders, say, here's the data we're seeing. Here are the issues we're seeing. And here's how we can get ahead of preventing, an issue happening.
Where do they find that information? Because I'm sure that's something that many people maybe.
Yeah, we have all this information. The good thing about our agency is most information is widely available. We put out a lot of data, and I'll make sure to get the links for the recording to have all the different types of data. So, and it's so granular too. Like, for disability discrimination, we get so granular. We tell you the different types of disability discrimination occurring, especially with long haul COVID. Remember the issues with brain fog, with lung issues. We really break it down to how many cases we're getting on the various areas, whether it's physical disabilities, whether it's mental health issues. So we really have it very broken down on our website, which is EEOC.gov, and all the different statistics you could see. Well, here's the rise in age discrimination. Here's it lowered.
Wow.
There's a huge after COVID vaccines came out, there were a lot of people who wanted exemptions related to religion. So there's a huge spike in religious claims. So it's really year to year where you're seeing a lot of the changes. That's why we put that information out there. And, for the real data geeks out there, we actually have a Tableau dashboard where they can
nice.
They can download some of that data and put it in their own system. So
one of the other misconceptions that I kind of hear is like government's so slow to move and react. Like when you, for example, remote work, right, or the pandemic, How quickly from that moment did it take you then to put some report out, a report out to share your insights, etc., for guidance?
Well, during the pandemic, we were doing it in real time through questions and answers because, we were watching the news, we were seeing what's happening, about whether it's disabled workers needing accommodations, needing additional PPE, or some of the different arrangements related to returning to the office. So in a sense, the COVID was a little easier just because it was the top news story and everyone was dealing it. It gets a little trickier with some of the issues that aren't, national news, such as pregnancy discrimination, or religious discrimination, or some of these just other, because we have so many different protected categories, national origin, race, color discrimination, which is different than national origin. So really discrimination based on disability, genetic information. So it's so hard to keep up with all the other, what's going to be the bigger issue that year. So that's why we really get ahead of that data and put it out there for the public.
And I'm sure now the next wave is AI, right? Artificial intelligence, as workplace technologies, are they going to be aligning with employment law?
Yep.
Talking about data as well, data security and people's personal data as well. There's a lot of, I'm sure that must be a question now that's being thrown at you.
And here's, where, since I've been at the commission, really have tried to slow everything down and saying that, yes, and same with HR professionals, there's always going to be something that's going to distract you in the news, that's going to, have claims of discrimination that you're going to have to be dealing with on the compliance side. But we have to address AI in the workplace. And because this is going to be bigger than any of the issues we talked about now. Because as you know, HR technology, whether it's AI, machine learning, way before generative AI, is exploding.
Yeah.
And, I say, once I started digging into it, and when I first started looking at it, in late 2020, early 2021, like many, I was confused to what we're even talking about. I thought it was very industry specific. Okay, manufacturing, retail, logistics, we actually have robots replacing human workers. Well, that's not going to affect knowledge workers. That's not going to be across all industries. So I thought that was actually about doing the work. But then when you dive into it, you see that there's HR tech vendors using AI to make all different types of employment decisions that normally HR professionals would make, from the very beginning to draft a job description, where to advertise, how to review the resumes, who to select for the interview, to conduct to schedule the interview, to conduct the individual, onboarding, compensation,
everything,
upskilling, reskilling, and even termination, right? Across the board, A to Z of the employment relationship, the candidate experience, the employee experience, the post-employment experience, right? All these different things. There is some AI technology out there that entrepreneurs are developing to sell into HR departments. And that's when I realized that we really need to get involved here, because now, as everyone knows, but even before, especially for large global organizations, it's no longer a question, are you going to use AI in HR? We are so far past that point.
Yeah.
The question now is, what are you going to use? How are you going to use it? What purpose are you going to use it for within your organization? And most importantly, to my concern, how are you going to comply with longstanding laws that apply to those decisions, whether or not you're using technology to make that decision or you're using your human workers? And that's where I'm trying to change the narrative on this, because if you look how these products are being sold, again, not picking out any type of HR tech product, let's just any of them, they're all being sold on being more efficient, more economical, to make better employment decisions. A lot of them on the skills-based side of it, which is what the law requires, right? To make decisions free of bias, free of any protected characteristics on the actual merit, and to do it, better than your current humans are doing it, by eliminating the biggest problem that HR has faced since its existence, which is the human.
Human bias.
If we eliminate the human from employment decision-making, then there'll be no bias. Everything will be perfect. My agency will go out of business, which would be a good thing, right? Because then there's no employment decision. There's no employment discrimination. I don't want us to go out of business, but You know what I'm saying? That a lot of it is on like, look, there's bias in employment.
There's bias in the way that the code.
Well, that's how you have to break it down.
Yeah.
And that's why I said, well, let's kind of decipher this as HR professionals, as people who are not technologists, and understand really, how this technology is being developed and how it's being used. And that was really, it took a lot of work, because you have to understand, where the market is coming from, what HR buyers want, and then the complexities of actually trying to implement these systems within your organizations. And they're all different concerns. And that's when I came to the realization that, for AI in HR to work, it has to be carefully designed and properly used. And those are two completely separate and distinct concepts. But here's the kicker, is that no matter who's designing the program, whether you buy it, whether you develop it yourself, that organization under our laws is going to be liable for whatever decisions it makes, because only the company can make an employment decision. And that's really where, a lot of the interest in getting this right, both from the vendor side and from the user side, it comes into play.
It's so interesting, because that was one of my questions, like, who is responsible if the AI makes a discriminatory employment decision? Is it the liability of the vendor, or is it the employer?
Well, under current laws, our laws in the United States, which a lot of countries follow, the EU with the EU AI Act is changing this, and you're seeing some states in the United States trying to get there as well. There's only 3 parties that can make an employment decision: companies, employers, staffing agencies, and unions. That's our world. Only they can make an employment decision. So when we show up for an investigation, we're only looking at that employment decision that employer made. And if that employer is saying, well, I don't know how this employment decision was made because we used the vendor, that doesn't matter to us. Our job is easy on that sense. So that's how we look at that only the employer can make an employment decision, right? Because the company you're working for, the staffing agency you're working for, the union you're working for is the one hiring you, is the one firing you, is promoting you, demoting you, right? Is paying you. So that's really where using AI in HR is just different than using it in different types of your organization, right? So if you're using AI to make your widgets faster, to make shipping routes faster, right? The vendor liability is potentially different there, right? A lot of contractual issues there, not to sound too much like a lawyer, but the bigger issue is that unlike using AI in other parts of your business, when you're using AI in HR, you're dealing with people's fundamental civil rights to enter and thrive in the workforce, provide for their family, and not be discriminated against, which is no different than the human side. So I'm also trying to change the narrative there and saying, that's why it's so important, for HR buyers to understand, and we'll break it down, those 2 different concepts, that the AI has to be, properly designed. It also has to be carefully implemented and used within your organization.
What advice would you give to HR leaders when they're thinking about choosing different vendors? What are some of the questions maybe they should be asking?
Yeah, this is where it's really tough, because the vendors, they're entrepreneurs, they understand technology, and we have to break it down into verbiage that HR professionals understand. And when we talk about, well, what is it, a data set, right, for us? Well, that's your applicant flow, your current employees, of who, you receive resumes for. And then, what are you asking the algorithm to do, right? Because there's a lot of confusion about, are we going to use AI? Should we use AI versus human decision making? And at the end of the day, there's only a finite amount of employment decisions, right? Hiring, firing, wages, training, benefits, promotions, scheduling, all this, these issues. And AI hasn't come up with a new type of employment decision yet, right? So we're just asking AI to either make that decision for us or give us more data and information to make that decision better. So a lot of it is reframing it too, that at the end of the day, you're already making those same employment decisions that you're going to bring an AI vendor to help you make, right? So a lot of that is also just slowing down, saying you're already doing this one way or the other. And what are your current requirements when you're making those employment decisions? And that's where really you can get into the issues related to the implementations of these AI systems and how they can potentially completely remove bias from the process, or they can scale bias greater than any individual human can do. And those are the two different concepts.
Yeah.
So on the sort of two different kind of issues from a legal perspective, I think this is the sort of, value I bring to this equation, because it's going to be our investigators, the EEOC, who are going to be showing up, to investigate these claims. There's really just two types of issues when you're dealing with the design of these programs. One is the more kind of data set discrimination, which there's been so much talked about.
Yeah.
When all the resumes are male, right? And there's only a couple females, then, you've heard these horror stories of the females getting lower scores just because that was overwhelmingly in the data set, right? Mm-hmm. So that's on the design of it, right? And that's what the algorithm is going to be looking at. So the algorithms have to be much more sophisticated than saying, well, just because the vast amount of resumes are men, being a male must be the overwhelming qualification for the job, which of course is unlawful. And how do we get to the point where these systems are designed saying, well, let's completely mask and not look at any of these protected characteristics, such as, age, such as, any indicators that you may be American versus British, right? All these things you can't make an employment decision on. And how do we get these tools so sophisticated enough that even if it's all men, there's still some underlying skill there that those resumes have risen to the top outside of being a male. And then how do we design those systems looking for that actual skill? And that's really how you can use these to get that skills based approach to employment decision making. So, that's so much on the technical design that even if you have, these discriminatory data sets, what's the next level of having algorithms look past that? And that's really where I think AI can help us a lot. There's a lot of long-standing studies about, as a male and female resume apply for the same job. Male is more likely to get selected. In the US, African Americans and Asian Americans who whiten their resume by deleting any reference towards their race, are likely to get selected when those are off their resume than not. So, that's a problem to begin with. But if the AI is carefully designed, it can look at the resume and ignore all those factors that a human really can't ignore, right? And actually get to the bottom line skills and qualification. But so much of that is on the design. So let's imagine now that an AI tool can do that, right?
Yeah.
That it doesn't look at any of these race, sex, national origin, religion, et cetera. And it's just taking your skills-based approach to hiring, and it gets you, the most qualified candidates in there. The AI is doing its job. And of course, what you're asking the AI to do are skills, either inferred from the data sets, or you're saying, here's the skills that we believe are not discriminatory because these are necessary for the job, right? Based upon our industry, based upon our organization, which employers have an obligation to do. Yeah. So then, you talk about, working with the vendor. So the vendor does their job. Now you have an HR professional within your organization now having more access to data than ever before, right? So instead of just PDF resumes with an Excel chart, now you have all these dashboards where showing all these potential characteristics that you're not allowed to make an employment decision on. So think about before, the longstanding stat and talent acquisition, before this technology, a resume, you have 6.5 seconds for a TA professional to read the resume. Your whole life, 6.5 seconds in front of you when you're applying for a job. So if somebody has bias before technology, I don't want to hire a woman for the job. To go through each resume, oh, that's a female sounding name, that's a woman's college, in the trash, right? It took time to discriminate before technology. But now with this technology, in 0.7 seconds, you can eliminate hundreds of thousands of applications based upon gender, based upon any of these protected categories, just because the information is so widely available. Again, not only if that information is made available by the vendor on the design side, but then also that individual human is injecting their own bias into the algorithm, at scale, to the likes we've never seen before. Yeah. And think about it too in employee advertising cases, right? Where you're putting a job description and you're advertising, on the internet. If you're limiting, whether it's through social media channels or others, saying, well, I want to only show this employment advertisement to certain groups, everyone who doesn't see that group on the basis of not being in that age range and not being in that gender.
You can choose specific, yeah.
Millions of people potentially can be discriminated against just by not seeing that job offer based upon, if they were qualified for the job. So you could just see the scalability of these tools on both sides.
Both sides of the spectrum.
On the data or on the actual individual use. And that's why these conversations are so important. And it's not unfamiliar to HR professionals to build parameters around any of these types of decisions.
Yeah. What are some of the specific things that you're doing at the EEOC to address some of those issues?
So, number one, all these different HR technologies are all within our purview. So, I think...
What does that mean within your purview?
That they're regulated because they're making or assisting with an employment
What do they have
decision.
to provide you as part of that?
So to us, they don't really have to provide anything until there's an investigation. So how do we prevent those investigations?
You don't want to get there.
It's not like some other governments where they're requiring you to disclose.
Yes, that's what I meant.
That's where a lot of this is going. And what you're
Do you
seeing...
think it's going to go, that's where it's going to go?
I think there's going to be a big debate. I think a federal law in the United States is going to be difficult on this. I think the Brussels effect is certainly EU AI Act is certainly making waves here in London, in the United States as well. And a lot of companies are going to have to start complying, just very much like GDPR, with some of those.
Yeah.
Not all of them, but some. Maybe some of the disclosure requirements, some of the auditing requirements, which we'll talk about, best practices of what employers can do now. But from our perspective, what we're doing at the EEOC, what I'm doing specifically is not only going to all these conferences, not only meeting with the vendors directly. And I have to say, in this area, the vendors really believe in their products. They believe that this is going to fundamentally change employment decision-making where there's been a lot of problems, which is why my agency exists. In the last 2 years, we've collected over $1.2 billion US for employers for violating our laws.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Right. So, I mean,
Wow.
And if there's...
In a year?
2 years. That was a 2 year period. So that's $600 million a year.
Wow.
Yeah. So
clearly some issues then.
right. So it's just, and that's where we have to be careful here in this conversation. I don't like to just talk about the potential for these tools to discriminate. I like to talk also about the positive of how it can help us make better employment decisions.
Yeah.
If not, then we're left with the processes that we've been dealing with since the 1960s in HR. And that's not really helping promote equal employment opportunity.
Yeah.
That's not helping better candidate experiences, better workplace experiences. So you have to, you have to be very balanced in my position, saying, look, you can use whatever tool you want. However, there's going to be certain issues under the law if it's not designed properly or used. So let's talk about just an easy to understand example. A lot of hiring now for high volume hiring is through apps.
Yeah.
So, you're
many of the founders on the show. Yeah.
Right. And so let's think about, let's just break it down. And I don't say it's great. I don't say it's terrible. I just have to give the picture of what the law requires. So think about walking into an interview or now everything on Zoom. What is the first thing you see on that candidate when they walk in the room?
What they're wearing?
You see them. You see everything about them.
Yeah.
Everything you're not allowed to make an employment decision on. The color of their skin, their potential religion if they're wearing religious garb, their sex, their national origin, their age, if they're disabled, if they're pregnant. And in the back of an interviewer's mind, just by human nature, it's very difficult to forget that. So if a disabled candidate comes into you, during an interview, and you see that they're physically disabled, how much is this going to cost me in accommodations? Pregnant, going to need leave. And then somebody else comes who's not going to make those requests. It's so easy historically for an interviewer to say, I'm going to go with that candidate. I'm just going to send the disabled candidate, the pregnant candidate, a letter saying, thank you for applying. We went with a qualified candidate, typical rejection letter. At the end of the day, nobody will ever know because nobody would admit to violating the law like that. So think about all those individuals that historically never been able to get past that first point. Even if you can get past the resume filters that we were just talking about, and then you see somebody. So that's why, a lot of these tools to do the entire interview on an app eliminates that.
Yeah, but a lot of companies now, especially for high volume, using like the onboarding agents where you ask the questions and
right.
Again,
And
not seeing any...
talk about a skills-based approach. Because I don't care what you look like. I don't care what your religion is.
Yeah.
Again, what the law requires. This is not new. It's saying we're going to ask you questions, And those questions, we believe, is what is most important for you to work in an organization. And we're going to use natural language process. Let's say one that does a voice interview, right? Here, answer this question. Here's a real life situation. And as you know, the natural language processes go through and looks at the order of the words you're responding, and if it meets with the employer's qualifications. Not about what you look like, nothing else in that. And that's good, right? Because then you're just getting that raw transcript, and that's being graded based upon your answers that you'd then be able to say are relevant to this job as an employer. Good. What's the bad? Well, again, very repetitive here. It goes back to the design of that. So let's say the candidate, has a very thick foreign accent. And, I speak fluent American English, you speak fluent British English, and, the algorithms can pick us up 99% of the time.
Yeah.
Perfect translation. Somebody comes in with a very thick German accent, we'll say. It's a kind of classic example. Very thick, rough translation into English. If it only picks you up 50% of the time because of the accent, then, us who speak 90, fluent English, we get a perfect transcript that the natural language processing can go through versus that person with a thick foreign accent, or somebody who's disabled, who slurs, or has a stutter, or somebody who's religious observant and their mouth is covered. They're going to be penalized based upon that protected characteristic. Yeah. So that person with a thick foreign accent may have given 100 times better interview than we did. But if it only picks us up 25% of the time, that's where we're going to start out. And that's not equal opportunity there. And that's discriminating against religion, national origin, disability, whatever that, barricade was to getting that transcript is the, can be the issue. And then forget about the technology. So then you're getting back into the same issues HR professionals have been dealing with, is that these are just employment assessments. And employment assessments have been around since the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. Before, they used to be very boring on pencil and paper. But now these tools allow an employee to do a candidate to do an employment assessment at any hour of the night. And then you're going to have to show, well, is that really relevant to the job? And we've seen a lot of these employment assessments have discriminated against certain groups. Yeah. So it's a lot of these same concepts that then get to the next layer of it as well, which HR professionals are dealing with. But going back to even that voice transcription, that's where really have to rely on the vendors to show that they're able to account for a disability. And that's really
maybe like an option there to say that, right?
Right.
But even then, like, not everyone interviews well over video and audio, right? One of there's a guy called Cameron who was like one of the best salespeople ever to work with me, and during the interview process, I was like, everyone was like, oh, he didn't interview well, but he was super knowledgeable, but he wasn't like enthusiastic, he wasn't charismatic, he wasn't, all the things that people go, oh, that's going to be a great salesperson, but actually end up being one of the best employees for the company ever. But I think if
these go back to the same issues talent professionals have been struggling with to begin with, but you just see when you're integrating technology in there, the scalability, but also if it picks up, and if you're looking for this qualification in the example I just gave you, and there's a classic one like, oh, we want all our salespeople to smile, and we're going to use facial recognition on Zoom to see if that they're staring at the camera and they're smiling, because that's what we want for our salespeople. Well, what happens if you can't smile because of disability? What happens because if the country you're from, it's inappropriate to smile during a sales meeting, but you would be the best salesperson at that company. So this gets back to a lot of the basic employment assessment issues that we've been dealing with. But now that it's technology, just the way it's being implemented so quickly, we sometimes forget, some of those principles you have to deal with in HR to begin with.
Are you collaborating with other agencies as well? Because obviously every agency right now has to be looking at AI and the impact as well. What kind of collaboration do you
so there's a lot of collaboration within the U.S. government and across the board. This is a global issue. And I think with HR, more than other areas of using AI, because we're industry agnostic, because it's being used, the same HR software in AI is being used in every continent where there's workers, right? So it's not like this is a USA specific issue.
Yeah.
It's all this world. This is a global issue. So that's why you're seeing a lot of governments cooperate with each other in this area. You're also seeing in the U.S. government, the different agencies coming together. The FTC saying, well, if you're advertising employment products, AI products that are making false advertising claims, you'll deal with it on that side. The EEOC deals with the bias side. The housing issues related to this, the finance issues related to this. It's just really across the board, but a lot of the principles are the same. But what we've been doing as an agency is that we've been putting out guidance saying that, for instance, the first guidance we put out was about how are workers with disabilities going to use these tools? And, if you have a disability, how are you going to be doing what they're supposed to be doing with bias audit testing? So, we've really been trying to see, well, what is the biggest issues that employers who want to buy these programs are facing, the questions they have, and people who want to develop them. How do we get ahead of that? Because where we started, this is just too big to deal with the ramifications after the fact, because it's really going to impact every employee in the world.
Yeah. It goes back to your point earlier, though, about the misconception that they only see you when there's something negative, to a negative interaction with your agency.
Right. And the difference here, though, unlike other areas, is that, until some of these laws change, again, you're seeing governments around the world doing this. Employees don't know they're being subject to these algorithms. We're in it, so we get it. But most of the average person, no idea.
They're going to have no idea. They probably don't even know to even look into it, whatsoever. They're like, okay,
right. I'll just do the interview on my phone.
I didn't hear anything back.
I assume a human's going to look at it. I assume I'm going to meet with somebody. They don't know. So, from a law enforcement perspective, if employees don't know that their civil rights are being violated by an algorithm, they can't come forward and complain of employment discrimination.
They don't even know.
Right. So that's why we have to be so proactive and saying, yeah, these tools can work if they're properly designed and carefully used. And I really think that's the theme we need to be thinking of. Some of it you can control, of having those policies and procedures in place, making sure that all your HR employees who have access to these tools are properly trained in the laws and regulations of your area where you're using them. But not only that, in your own company's culture as well. And that's why you're seeing so many of these tech companies come out and saying, here's our AI principles. The White House has put out, a blueprint for a Bill of Rights when it comes to AI, saying, here's how, the government's going to use AI. You're seeing big tech companies coming in. Here's how we're going to use AI. And I think that's really important too, within the organization. And a lot of that is under your control. So some of the technical design stuff, you're going to have to work with the vendor, and they're going to have to show you how that's going to work on your workforce with your applicant pool for that job description in that part of the world where you want to do that advertisement, how it's going to get you qualified candidates and not discriminate.
Yeah.
And train your employees to make sure they're doing it right. The second part of it is that as an organization, and this is really, really believe CHROs can take the lead on, because you're doing it anyway, because you have a people culture that you've built policies, procedures around, and in making sure that you're not only compliant, but whatever your ethics are, whatever the trust within your organization. And we're throwing that all out the window because, now AI is coming in, we don't understand it, as HR leaders because it's technology. And that's not true. Just go back. What are you using it for? And what are your current policies and procedures around those same decisions? And now start integrating and amending those, saying, if AI is going to be in the equation, it's going to be no different than if the way we've been doing it in a lawful and ethical way.
Yeah.
And there's just a lot of chaos and noise because it's technology. And that's where I think HR leaders really need to take the lead on, because you've developed those policies for your organization across the board for decades.
Yeah. It's hard though, right? It makes sense, like you're saying, to use that as your solid foundation of decision making, despite the noise and every shiny object coming towards you and a lot happening. But you can still be grounded. So despite the disruption, innovation, this is where we make decisions. And if it doesn't align with that, then the answer is no. Right? It can steer.
But that's your own culture, and that's your own organization, which may be different than others. And I think that's what's so important, is that comfort level, of saying, well, here's what we want to use AI with. Here's what we don't feel comfortable using, AI with. And again, because there's products out there of A to Z of the employment relationship, you may say, well, we're comfortable using AI to review resumes, to schedule interviews, or you may say, well, we're comfortable using AI to hire and fire employees, to completely do performance reviews for employees, just to completely automate and outsource. You're allowed to do that. You can delegate this to an algorithm. Now, whether there's going to be issues, whether you need a human in the loop, I'm not encouraging that, but I'm just saying it goes back to what are the principles of your organization, and what kind of transparency and fairness are you going to have within your organization that you already have, and how are you going to implement that in AI?
Yeah. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you
Right.
should be doing it. Has there been any large government or private enforcement actions related to AI yet?
It's been, like I just said, it's hard. It's hard because we just don't, know. Candidates, employees don't know, whether they're being terminated, whether they're not being
You think
paid
that's going to
fair.
increase as people
I
get
think
more
as what you're
educated?
starting to see is like in New York, local law 144, which got international attention, the EU AI Act. There's a proposal as in California. A bill was just passed in Colorado where it's essentially saying if you're using high-risk systems, and what is a high-risk system? HR has fallen into the
Has
EU's.
it?
For the most part, yeah.
Okay.
Not for scheduling an interview or really asking for a form for your benefits, but making an employment decision, making a salary decision, which would be in the higher risk system along with, financial decisions, anything really impacting civil rights and civil liberties. Then you're going to have to disclose. And some go as far as saying you're going to have to tell the candidate that here's the software we're using, here's exactly how it's going to rate you, and here are your remedies if you want to opt out. That's extreme. We don't have that at a national level in the United States, but you're starting to see certain areas, certain governments require that. When that happens, and then somebody doesn't get a job, and then they talk to some of their friends and say, who look the same, who are the same age, and say, yeah, I didn't get a job there, either. Then you can say, well, maybe age played an unlawful role in an algorithm because here's what the factors that we're looking for. So that's where I think a lot of it is going. If you look at the trends of where these state and local laws are going, you're seeing consent, the requirement to opt in, or the ability to opt out. And again, a lot of these are just proposals as well. Disclosure that you're being subject to the algorithm, banning, emotional recognition, facial recognition, from some of these processes, that there's software out there to do, just completely banning some uses of it. Some states in the United States too have said facial recognition is almost, in Illinois and Maryland, there's acts that basically make it impossible to use during a candidate interview. So, you're starting to see that patchwork of saying, well, here's outright ban uses. If you're going to use it in certain areas, we're going to require you tell the candidate, which is a consumer in our world. A lot of these are consumer laws and what they're being subject to.
Yeah.
And until that happens, it's going to be very hard for a candidate to know.
It's hard because you kind of touched on a point I was going to ask. There's so many headlines across the world about people calling for new laws for AI in the workplace, but it seems like it's not as simple as it seems to make that happen, because you're talking about state by state,
country by country. But look at what are the common themes. I think one of the most important common themes, which the EEOC, which the Department of Labor, have all come out and said, and even here in the UK, having worked with them, it's about self-regulation and doing bias audits yourself. And even if you're not required, like New York City is requiring bias audits.
Okay.
The EU will require bias audits in some of these tools to make sure that they're doing what they're saying they're doing, pre-deployment, and then yearly, or as your data set changes. And that's a good thing. And we encourage that, because look, if you're buying an AI tool, and you're saying, here are the skills we believe is necessary for this job, and that skill completely discriminates against a certain category.
Yeah.
If you have technology, you can do a pre-deployment audit where before in HR, you put out a job description and then you see not a single female applies. It's too late at that point, right? And here, using this data and technology, we're able to assess in real time if it's doing what it says it's supposed to be doing, or if it's discriminating, and fix it before you ever make a decision on someone's livelihood. So that's the benefit of doing these pre-deployment audits or yearly audits, or as the data set changes. Again, what does that mean to HR leaders? Well, if you're changing some of the job skills, it's job requirements. If you're changing some of the year requirements, is that going to have an impact on certain groups? And to be able to do that in real time and fix it before it goes live is something we haven't had before. And that will prevent discrimination and keep you in compliance with the law. And you don't need a government to tell you to do that, even though a lot of them are. So I think that's where a lot of it's going, is saying, well, if you want to use these tools, do an audit in advance. Make sure that the skills you're requiring and the way the algorithm is looking at the qualifications are actually going to get you the best candidates and not discriminate. And you know what? That's based upon longstanding law and principles.
Yeah. I didn't realize that. I was just thinking what you're saying. I didn't realize that AI in HR is being designated as high risk. but it makes complete sense based on everything.
Civil rights. You're dealing with, fundamental rights. You call different things in different countries.
Yeah.
But, think about that. The ability to provide for your family. That's really, that's up there. So, and that's why, going back to my agency, we're a civil rights agency.
Yeah.
And that's what HR deals with. You're dealing with employees' civil rights to not be discriminated against.
Yeah. Do you think that we're ever going to reach a global consensus?
I think you're starting to see a commonality between a lot of the proposals. I think everyone has sort of like, if you look at some of the principles a lot of tech companies have put out or governments put out, just about their own use of it: transparency, accountability, fairness, not having bias. And I think you're having these state and local or foreign governments basically start to say, okay, if you're going to use AI, disclosure, reporting in some places, auditing, and then it gets into the data world, which is a little out of my wheelhouse about ownership of the data, into the GDPR world.
Yeah.
So I think you're going to start seeing a lot of commonalities between countries. And it's important because this is, like I said, especially in HR, this is global.
Yeah. And most of the companies that we speak to are global companies.
Right.
And depending on the different countries and continents, there's different laws and regulations. It's hard for them to keep up as well, right? Things are moving so quickly. It's a real challenge.
It's challenging. A lot of people, post-COVID, a lot of governments, a lot of groups have a lot of interest in HR. We talk so much, and you've talked on this podcast about how HR has taken a huge lead, in COVID, and really has shown the business function of this job. Well, with that comes additional scrutiny.
Yeah.
If you look at, some of the union pushes in the United States and across the world, labor and employment and HR is just really taking a front seat with employee, activism, with social media. I mean, these are really big ticket items for corporate boards now. And, I think AI is playing such a big role in that, especially, when you get into the generative AI equation.
Yeah. And it's interesting to see how HR is leading the way with AI in the workplace. I don't think that's something if you said a few years back.
No.
That people were like, because you mentioned about the applications in, retail, in manufacturing, and those were like, okay, that makes sense. But now the applications that are affecting the labor and the workforce, I think many people didn't see the real impact of that. And now we're starting to see it play out.
Right. Especially with the, remote work and people applying for jobs all across the world. We just never dealt with those issues. You'd apply to a job in a company in, your city, right? And it was very easy for employers to say, well, what is the hiring pool within my city? What is the breakdown of this? We don't have people, from this national origin or, or this religion. And even if it's, going to have an impact, there's nothing we can really do about it. But now essentially the whole world is your applicant pool.
Yeah.
Because of the technology. And it just really changes the dynamic of auditing to make sure you're not excluding people based upon a protected characteristic at scale. So I think that's a really important concept.
Yeah. How do you see this playing out over the next couple of years? You're in such a unique position where you're seeing it both internally, externally, in the conversations you're having globally, which is great that you've taken the time to step out the office and actually, which many others don't, from my understanding, to really understand the global impact as well.
That this technology is going to continue to develop, and it's going to, it's the real struggle is going to be, how do we, not are we using it, but how do we implement it properly with all these changing requirements? Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of that is just going to get into the testing phase of it. I know that sounds kind of boring, but all you can do, no matter what you want to use for it, whether it's compensation, whether it's for, promotion, or even employee management. Don't forget, there's a lot of software out there telling you what you're going to do for work that day. And also, I'm going to grade you using an algorithm if you've made enough products for the day, right? So it's for each of those uses, it's ensuring and doing that testing. And here's the problem. A lot of these tools are being sold to save companies money. And if there's undoubtedly they will, right? Especially on the hiring side. But at the same time, so we're asking companies to spend money on this advanced technology, on this transformation into AI, to remove bias, to make more fair, transparent employment decisions, all these buzzwords we have. But not only that, because that liability from us rests with the company, the next layer of there's no other way to put this, spending money, is these governance programs around it. It's making sure that you have those policies and procedures in place, making sure that, the employees who have access to these tools have the recurrent training, in our laws to make sure that they're making, not using these tools to discriminate as well. And that audit component to it too.
Yeah.
But that's how it's going to work. And, that's where the rubber is going to meet the road, because you could use it confidently that, that the tools are doing what they're saying they're doing because you've tested it yourself.
Yeah, love it. Before I let you go, what would be your parting advice? And then where can people reach out to you if they want to connect with you?
Well, reaching out to me is easy. Just find me on LinkedIn.
Keep it simple.
Keep it simple, like everywhere it goes. Where, look, I just think that this is where really, understanding HR, this is where you can really play a huge role. And it's not as complicated as you think. I like to use the example of most companies have extremely robust, let's just use sexual harassment policies. After the Me Too movement, what happened? From the board to the C-suite, everyone said, we are going to be a company that doesn't sexually harass. And if you're sexually harassed, we don't care if you're the CEO or we don't care if you're a higher sales producer, you're going to be fired, right? And they had trainings, open door policies, and HR led that movement because something bad happened. So how do we now flip that and bring that into the AI equation? Mm-hmm. Well, let's from the top. HR leaders need to make sure that their boards, their C-suite are saying, here's how we're going to ethically and lawfully use AI, especially when it comes to our employees.
Yeah.
Right? Number one. Number two, HR needs to build those policies saying that, whether it's an applicant or current employees being subject to these tools, that if somebody misuses these tools, just like if somebody sexually harasses you, there's an open door policy and that person is going to be fired, just like violating other kind of employee policy, right? So it goes back to where HR leaders can really thrive is around those policies, procedures, and that bring that cultural ethics, cultural compliance blend, trustworthiness, right? Because a lot of days, if your employees, at the end of the day, if your employees are not trusting that your pay is fair, that your hiring practices are fair, they're going to believe, and it's going to lead to potential discrimination anyway. So it's going back to those basic principles and now it's just reinventing those when it comes to AI and saying, here's how we're using it within our organization, and here's how it's going to benefit you, and here's what everything we're doing to. So I think a lot of it is building that trust within your organization that HR leaders are very good at.
Yeah. Wow. I feel like we need to do a whole series. Commissioner, I appreciate you coming on. And thank you so much for taking the time out to join us. The work you're doing is obviously truly making an impact globally. And honestly, it's quite refreshing, the fact that you do take the time out to travel globally, speak at events, really, you're really changing the stigma and narrative of the agency. I feel like through all the work you're doing, but more importantly, helping HR professionals thrive, and also impact the millions of employees that they serve around the world. So thank you for your time.
It's my pleasure. And I want this technology to work just like anyone else, because it can really help us eliminate bias. It can help us in our mission to prevent employment discrimination and advance equal employment opportunity in the workplace. And that's really where I think the time and effort is worth it now for all of us.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks so much.
Cool. Thanks for having me.